Author Tim Denevi is currently visiting nonfiction writer in the MFA program at George Mason University in Fairfax. He's previously been awarded fellowships by the MacDowell Colony, the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and the Community Writers of Squaw Valley. In Hyper, A Personal History of ADHD, he simultaneously covers the history of the science and medicals community, general understanding and recognition of ADD-ADHD, as well as his family's and his own adaptation to their particular set of issues. We learn in these pages, as any person who has ADD or ADHD knows, that the symptoms of ADD, ADHD can change day to day, and that whether you're on medication or not, in therapy or not, each day presents its own set of challenges to overcome. We're so excited to hear Mr. Nevi's fascinating perspective, so will you all please join me in welcoming him to Politics and Prose.
How's everybody doing tonight? Well, thank you guys all for coming out. I'll just read a short passage tonight. It's good to see all of you. I'd like to thank Politics and Prose for having this excellent event. I'd like to thank everybody who's come out from a long way away, especially my family, especially my father, who's come out all the way from California. And I'm just going to be reading a short portion tonight. It's from the first and second part of the book. And I don't think there's anything you need to know about it, and we'll just jump in, and then we'll have a question and answer session afterwards. Thank you again for coming out. In the spring of 1985, after an initial round of medical tests, my pediatrician, Dr. Atkinson, ordered evaluations at Stanford University Medical Center, a kind of group therapy that I remember most strikingly for its pair of note-taking doctors. These psychiatric professionals were charged with assessing my behavior. During hour-long sessions, I was kept in a pen with two other children in an asphalt outdoor playground with a high chain-link fence. We were all 5 years old. The boy had an enormous head. His teeth were spaced unnaturally, and he wore heavy black glasses that never fell from his face, even though he couldn't stop moving, much less yelling. In contrast, the girl hardly spoke. She was small and frail. Whenever I talked to her, she'd gaze at my knees or at something behind me, her eyes surfacing as if through gray water. At the time, I didn't understand any of it, especially why I'd been grouped together with them, and each new session began to feel like a mistake. Soon enough, the people in charge would come to their senses and realize I shouldn't be here. These sessions lasted for about 2 months. On one of the last afternoons, I was standing against the fence when the boy sprinted past me, heading for the girl who'd been trying, delicately, to pedal a tricycle. He grabbed the tricycle and lifted it upwards, spilling her onto the blacktop. Then he leapt against the fence and began to shout. Both doctors quickly intervened, one leading the girl inside. The other, writing on his yellow legal pad, turned to me and said, without looking up, "Timothy, would you like a turn on the tricycle?" The tricycle was my favorite object on the playground. He knew this, of course. It was the other boy's favorite, too. Whenever things got dull, the tricycle tended to appear. But I couldn't move from the fence. The doctor kept scribbling. The boy hadn't stopped shouting. The second doctor emerged from the entrance, her eyes narrowed keenly on me. It was as if she could draw out and study my most alien aspect. I knew it had to do with my tantrums, and then I realized that both of these adults were waiting for me to throw one. They were betraying me. In the distance, the tricycle gleamed. I was overcome with helplessness, the way I always felt right before a tantrum. Just then, the session ended. My mother arrived smiling. They'd asked her to not stay and watch. She was always happy to see me, but this time I couldn't look at her. In the car, she kept asking me how it went. I nodded, then shook my head. "Are you hungry?" she said. "Should we stop for ice cream? Do you feel hot? Can you please tell me what's wrong?" "What's happening?" I finally asked. "Am I sick?" She was trying to keep her eyes on the road. "Honey," she replied. "Why would you say that?" And so the next section I'm going to read is one of the more historical parts of the book. And so the book intertwines between personal experience and then a broader essayistic perspective on ADHD. And so one other thing you need to know about this first scene that I just read and about a scene that's personal that I'll read in a little bit is that when I was growing up in the mid-'80s in San Francisco, they weren't sure what was going on. I was having these really severe emotional fits they thought that it might be epilepsy, and so that had to do with how I was being evaluated then and how I'll be evaluated in some other scenes. But this is one of the historical parts. When it comes to a disorder like ADHD, it's important to remember that treatment is a relatively modern concept. Up until recently, extreme behavior was explained along one of two lines, the moral view and the biological view. From the moral point of view, a person is mentally ill because he or she is inhabited by a demon. From the biological point of view, the brain is infected by a disease or damaged beyond repair. Either way, the prospect of a cure falls outside the scope of human agency. It was only a few hundred years ago when afflicted adults and children were chained or collared in their homes, beaten, thrown into pits, caged, and separated from everyone else. Eventually, spurred by the Enlightenment values of the 18th century, individuals with varying degrees of mental illness were removed to asylums. The goal wasn't simply isolation. A calm, structured environment was meant to be therapeutic. And starting in the 19th century, these settings offered the chance to apply what we now call psychotherapy, the establishment of a close relationship between a doctor and a patient that could lead to increased self-awareness through the power of suggestion. But by the 20th century, most asylums were overcrowded and poorly run, such as the notorious Georgia State Sanatorium in Milledgeville, which would grow to house 8,000 patients. Psychiatry was at a dead end, the medical historian Edward Shorter writes in A History of Psychiatry. His practitioners were concerned for the most part in how they managed asylums, and asylums had become mainly warehouses in which any hope of therapy was illusory. Enter Sigmund Freud. In retrospect, his timing was perfect. Freud was born in Austria in 1856. After considering a career in law, he decided to attend medical school at the University of Vienna, where he conducted research into the reproductive organs of eels. He also published a paper on cocaine's therapeutic properties. Eventually, he settled into the field of neurology, which at the time was focused on the treatment of psychiatric conditions such as hysteria. In the 1890s, Freud began formulating his famous version of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, while seeing members of the Viennese middle class for various neuroses. Based on the notion that repressed traumatic experiences, usually sexual, can create unconscious complexes and influence behavior in damaging ways, his treatment sought to unearth the source of this trauma and redirect the resulting emotions. In adults, he employed techniques like dream analysis and free association. He would meet with his patients in a demure residential setting where they would recline on a chaise leather couch 6 times a week for 50 minutes a day. Such intimacy was revolutionary, a style of interaction that was impossible in the asylum. Freud was one of the first psychiatrists to emphasize the importance of childhood experiences. He usually did so as a way of explaining the later onset of neuroses and psychoses in adults. But over his career, he also treated a small number of children for their behavioral problems. In a 1909 case study titled Analysis of Phobia in a 5-year-old Boy, Freud introduces us to Hans, a little Oedipus, living with his parents and younger sister in Austria. For more than 100 pages, Freud documents how Hans was suffering from a repressed erotic attraction to his mother that had manifested consciously as a fear of animals and their enormous penises. The reason he was afraid of horses now was that he had taken so much interest in their whittlers. He himself had not noticed that it was not right to be so severely preoccupied with whittlers, even with his own, and he was quite right in thinking this. Freud and Hans's father, also a psychoanalyst, analyzed the boy's dreams, particularly those about a crumbled giraffe, which they interpreted as a symbol of an oversized vagina. But their clearest window into the child's behavior arrived in the form of play therapy. They took notes as Hans used a penknife to slice apart the legs of his favorite rubber doll, Gret. Freud concluded that he and his father must explain to Hans the process of birth, the boy's father. So long as the child is ignorant of the female genitals, Freud wrote, there is naturally a vital gap in the comprehension of sexual matters. A birds and the bees conversation took place, and the boy, after a brief argument, accepted the explanation. His unconscious desires were transferred to his conscious mind. From then on, Freud assures us, Hans was no longer afraid of the many well-endowed horses clomping through the streets of Vienna. In 1909, psychoanalysis was just starting to gain worldwide notice. That year, Freud and Carl Jung visited America for the first time. Play therapy would eventually be applied to all types of childhood disorders, including ADHD. The analyst would observe a young boy or girl in a sandbox and deduce subconscious motives, how a decision to scoop here or there revealed a deeper environmental cause. It's similar to what I personally experienced in 1985 in that pen at Stanford University. The doctors trying to evaluate my unconscious mind. I was the same age as little Hans, separated by 75 years, a period of time that would witness Sigmund Freud's approach to therapy rise and fall as the dominant form of treatment for mental illness. And I'll read one more personal section. And again, this is from the same year as the first part that I read, where there was a lot of emotion, there were tantrums, there was a lot going on, and we were lucky. We lived in the Bay Area. There were options to try to figure it out. And so we had gone to a family doctor, then we had gone to a psychiatrist, and they thought it might be epilepsy. And so because they thought it might be epilepsy, one of the treatments was to get something called an EEG. And so this part is about the preparation for that EEG, which included staying up for an entire night. My psychiatrist at the time had a treatment in mind, but first he wanted to run one more test, a sleep-deprived electroencephalogram to measure brain patterns. My parents were tasked with keeping me awake an entire night. I still remember their extraordinary proclamation, no bedtime. I thought of it then as a reward, even though I couldn't figure out what I'd done to deserve it. The night started off well enough. My father had recently purchased a VCR, promoting its applications to anyone who would listen. Hey, Timo, now you can watch Scooby-Doo whenever you want. So he rented movies and invited over his best friend, Carlos Silveira, who'd played baseball and football with him at Santa Clara University. Carlo was Catholic from a Portuguese family and, as my mother always liked to point out, was raised by women. She enjoyed his careful but no less emotional perspective on life. We ate a large dinner. My sister fell asleep. I snacked on candy. My father drank beer. Around 8, my mother went to bed. She'd take the late shift. By 11, I was nodding off. More candy. Movies ran in a continuous flicker. Then jumping jacks, 20 questions, even a game of tag. Soon enough, I was being shaken awake at intervals by my father, a sensation like falling through the heft of the world, then being yanked all the way back to a life that, until then, had been delicately designed. And I was overcome by the same emotion I'd felt on that Stanford playground. Once again, the known universe had reversed itself, except this time, the instigation had to do with the people I knew best. I want to go to sleep, I said to my father. His eyes were heavy, the television a distant murmur. What? Daddy! Yeah. Am I in trouble? Are you mad at me? He looked up from the TV. Say that again? Please! I stomped my foot. My wrist caught a beer bottle. It clinked against another and another until one fell to the floor and shattered. My father sat up. So did Carlos Silveira. Why don't I take him outside for a bit, Carlos said. Just then my mother emerged in the kitchen light, her nightgown an unearthly yellow. I knew what was about to happen. Desperately, I wanted to apologize for the broken glass, my attitude, the tantrums in general. Even then, my concept of right and wrong had a distinctly Catholic slant, something I gleaned from Sunday school. If only my parents would yell at me instead of each other, everything could go back to normal. She glanced at the bottles on the counter. How many beers have you had? She said to my father. Not enough, my father said, smiling at his own joke. So you're so drunk you're breaking things? Go back to bed, he said. We're handling it. I can see that. He pointed at her. Go back to bed. In the next moment, they both started shouting, each finding fault with the other's approach to the problem, while Carlo picked me up and headed out the front door. I wanted to run between them and yell, look, and somehow reveal who I really was. Maybe then they'd stop trying so hard. But Carlo and I were already moving toward the sidewalk. The horizon was distant, its arch of lights, downtown San Jose, the mountains beyond. I'd never been outside so late at night. When I was your age, Carlo said calmly, setting me down, I used to climb onto the roof of our house. Have I ever told you about that? He'd grown up only a few miles north of here. His father was a boxer who died young from brain damage inflicted in the ring. Carlo was raised by his mother and Portuguese grandmother, who were even more emotional than my Italian relatives. As a child, he was willful. So were the women in charge. When the fights got really bad, everyone shouting and crying, he'd simply crawl out of the window and spend the night on the roof where the women couldn't reach him. In the morning, when I came down, he said, they acted like nothing had happened. I was walking alongside him, listening, barely awake. Then I heard my name, Timmy. We turned around. My mother was standing outside in her nightgown, calling us both. The next morning, we arrived at our local hospital just as the sun was coming up. I hadn't slept. I was, to put it mildly, a mess. My mother no longer remembers my psychiatrist's explanation for ordering the test. It was probably an attempt to eliminate any remaining possibility of epilepsy, but she thinks that he was actually looking to confirm his diagnosis that I had a damaged brain, which is how she explained it to me at the time, in a watered-down version, of course. I was taken into a white room. The EEG scanner sat in the corner. I don't like that thing, I said. The nurse planted sensors along my scalp and across my forehead and temples, the wires trailing back to the machine. I turned to my mother and said, "It's going to read my mind." "Timmy," she said. "Turn it off," I told her. "Honey, everything's okay. It's just a test." She patted me on the back and began to sing softly. And then I saw myself from a distance, a small, scrutinized shadow. Something oily was being hooked and drawn out of my chest. I opened my eyes, blinking. There was nothing I could do. The machine was ruthless. It was looking into the deepest part of me, and I understood the message being transmitted along the veil of wires, spoken as if in my own tongue. I am evil. Thank you. Thank you guys all for coming out. I very much appreciate it. What a beautiful bookstore. What a nice place that this is, and a nice place to come to reading. So any questions that you guys might have, I'd be happy to get deep on said questions and writing in general.
Hi, I don't know, jumping ahead to your actual treatment, did that involve medication? Or does
It eventually did. I mean, it was a bunch of different things. It was Ritalin at first, but this was 1986, and so it was seen kind of in a less individualized way than I would like to hope that it is now. And the doctor was very bossy and rude to my mother and just sexist, you know, and kind of didn't answer any questions, didn't give any information. It was a different time, and so the Ritalin went very poorly. And then after that, cognitive behavior therapy, which was with a really wonderful woman who's a dear friend of our family. And then eventually small doses of different kinds of medication later, but ones that I couldn't necessarily tell if they were working or not. So it became about having to be on medication because the dose was so low.
No, just one follow-up. So do you have any commentary? I mean, there's like this push and pull between, you know, such a large proportion of like high school students are taking some kind of upper now. A lot of them just so they can stay up and study, but, you know, I don't know what the percentage is, but some high percentage of kids now are classified as ADHD, and I believe that it really exists, but I don't think that it's like 15% of kids or whatever it is. So I just wondered if you had any comments on the balance of medication versus over-medication.
It's a hard balance, man. I think that if you look at the news articles since 1970, thank you for your question, most of them are like, it doesn't exist or it's not known if it exists. And now a lot of the news articles on it are much the way you characterized it. 5% of the population, if you apply the scientific method to the population in a good way, can be seen as being like extremely overactive. You know, that 5% is so much more overactive than the rest of the entire population. And what a stimulant does is it makes everything in front of you closer. And so it makes what you're trying to do have less interference. And so it works that way on everybody. And that's why they're kind of dangerous drugs, in that everybody sees something with less interference and closer, whether they're writing a really complex paper and they have no overactivity, or whether they just really want to run around and have to read this one thing or have to do this one thing. And to answer your question, I think part of the overdiagnosis just has to do with, in two ways. One, that it's a borderline disorder where it's pretty functional. I mean, there's a great PBS documentary on ADHD where they say, like, people with ADHD can do anything. They just don't do it so well. You know, like they can do anything anybody else does. They just don't do it very effectively. So that's a borderline disorder. There's much more seriously handicapping disorders within society. So when you ever have a borderline disorder, you're often going to have problems diagnosing it because it's right on the border. And secondly, a lot of it has to do, I think, with our healthcare system, where if your pediatrician is your main line, that's good luck, Thunder. If your pediatrician is your main line of defense, they're not specialized in identifying and seeing that. And the way our healthcare system is right now, you often can run into situations where the evaluation you get of like 10 minutes, ba-bum, 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 is not enough of attention paid to see what's going on. And what you often see a lot of times is also people that are having a really tough time with other things that are just said to be ADHD, when something even more debilitating, I think, than ADHD is going on. And so I like your question, especially in that I think there is a subset of the population that's overactive or struggles with inattention, you know, or impulsivity, and that because it's kind of on the border, it's a hard space to navigate, both in diagnosis and treatment.
I had a question. So the last sentence in that excerpt was, "I'm evil." Was there like a kind of, I know that a lot of, you know, sort of along with diagnosis of ADD and ADHD comes with depression, anxiety, things like that. Was there a lot of sort of kind of personal shame associated with your ADD, ADHD for yourself that you had to get through when writing about it?
Yeah, and that's a good question, but the personal shame was just the behavior. I mean, it wasn't like being ADHD was the shame. It was like standing up and screaming in a voice where everybody else is like quietly reading their book. Like that's what's embarrassing, is just the natural aspect of the behavior. And so I was always pretty aware of that and dealing with that. And so the ADHD at times, as a medical condition that concurrently in its history of being diagnosed happened to run against my personal history, could kind of become an outlet for those issues of feeling different and feeling shame. And again, I think ADHD is really interesting because you can have all the privilege in the world. You can have all of these people helping you in every way, from school to your background, you know, to everything that's been given to you. And you can still fall out of society and not make it and have a really terrible and difficult time. So a lot of times the argument is that like privileged kids are using ADHD to get an advantage over other privileged kids. One thing I think about ADHD, you know, as something that's 5% or a small of the population, is that it actually highlights how difficult it can be when something externally exists that's keeping children from getting to adulthood without having everything fall apart. And it's different than willpower. You know, those are two separate entities.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
Is this on? So I was a high school teacher for a number of years and a college professor now. When I was originally an undergraduate training to be a high school teacher, I think his name was Robert Coles, came to talk to us about, at that point in this is probably about 1980, the really remarkable subjectivity of the Learning Disabilities Test Battery. Do you know anything about whether that test battery has gotten any improvement in the last 30 years?
That's a good question. I mean, most of the research that I did went up to about 1990, 2000. And there's a wonderful article by Virginia Douglas, which is called Stop, Look, and Listen. And the reason ADHD is called ADD originally, you know, and why we all think of it as an attention-based situation is that in about 1975, she wrote this long article that became a presentation, and she talked about that. She's like, the test batteries are all subjective. You know, like the methods we're using are subjective. Like we need to be more rigorous in our application of the scientific method and also in the application of all the things we've learned up to this point to the data and material we see in front of us. So one of the things she was talking about was exactly what you're talking about, which is how do we get around this subjectivity and do our best to get more? And I think it's like, you know, collapsing towards zero. You'll never get there. You know, you're like having towards infinity. I think subjectivity, you know, as a postmodernist, like I'm going to say subjectivity is always going to influence whatever's going on. But I think there has been a concerted movement in testing. The thing about ADHD is it's hard because as much as you want to find it and, you know, help children that might fit into it get towards a more functional aspect of, you know, late adolescence and adulthood, it reflects back at you and what you're trying to do. It's become such a cultural, you know, stone that we touch and just tells us about us instead of telling us about what we want to see. So I think that's a really hard aspect of it, is trying to figure that out.
I saw so many parents for whom the medications really worked well and helped a lot, and so many other parents who were terrified that, they were labeling or, pigeonholing their kid and medicalizing them in a way that was going to damage their self-esteem, et cetera, et cetera. And it seemed to me like in the background, Big Pharma was going to be very heavily pushing people not to pay so much attention necessarily to a test battery as long as it kept getting more kids on medication. So I don't know how much the problem has or hasn't improved over the last 30 years, but I've been awfully curious about it.
It's a really good question. Andrew Sullivan, who's a great blogger at The Daily Dish, and it was a DC guy, he says, hey, Big Pharma saved my life with AIDS. He's like, it's evil. Like, I know Big Pharma is evil, but they saved my life with their AIDS drugs. And we want it to be this or that. We want it to be strictly a biological condition, or we want it to be a strictly experiential condition. And the thing is that whenever you get at the point of biology and personality, where it's experience and it's whatever background that you've got genetically, brain chemistry-wise, that's a gray area we're always going to be uncomfortable within. And again, it's always, going to sometimes give us windows back to us instead of giving us the window into what we're trying to look at, which is hard.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Could you comment on your teenage years and how that was your experience, and also for your family?
That's a good question. Lot of alcohol, lot of car accidents, not alcohol related, but just car accidents, not being able to drive well. To honestly comment on that, when it came to teenage years, things that accrued for a long time and people have been working really hard. I mean, teenage years are the hardest years you're going to get because you're on the cusp of making it and you're about to be out, and if things just keep going well for a little bit. So when I wrote about my teenage years, I also wrote about two of my friends that I thought were very similar to me. And both of those friends, for whatever reasons that were separate, didn't end up making it into adulthood. One committed suicide, one went to jail forever, 3 strikes law in California, for breaking into houses. And I think at the teenage years, it doesn't just become these issues of stigmatization. Will I be liked? Will I not? Will I get good grades? Will I be in this school? It becomes a matter of life and death, because you'll drive off a road, or you'll get hit by a bus, or you'll step out, or you'll, fall off a cliff. Like, crazy things will happen at that level when you combine a history of really bad impulsivity with the natural impulsivity that comes with being a teenager. And one thing about ADHD, I think that's important in the literature that I've read about it and researched in it, has to do with the idea that you don't measure ADHD generally. You measure it in relationship to appropriate grade level behavior. And by that I mean a 4-year-old's always going to seem impulsive and off the wall and wanting to run around to a 6-year-old or 7-year-old or 8-year-old. And so it's how you relate to other 4-year-olds, how you relate to other 8-year-olds. It's a developmental disorder, how you relate to other 15 and 16-year-olds. And the problem with high school, in the research that I've done and I found, is that that's when the stakes tend to get much higher. And it tends to become much harder. And it's a really difficult time. Thank you.
Hi, I have a son who has ADD, and he tells me tools that he uses because he has that, and one is that he takes the bus to work instead of driving because he would never get there on time. And I wondered what tools, if you would be willing to share, that you do to make your life work better.
That's a very good question. Being around people who are smart and nice and helping me is probably the biggest tool, and who are not making you more late and making things harder. Routine. Routine's a very important thing. So little things like that, like taking the bus, that's a great idea. It's different in adulthood. You're not, like, whatever they think ADHD is in adulthood, you can pass with the normals completely fine. Like, it's not, with all the neurotypicals, you roll deep with them. Like, it doesn't stick out as much as you would think. But you have restlessness, you have, like, perseveration, like how you get through things, and you have the way you see boundaries and deadlines and time. And so what you begin to notice is that you're messing up things for people around you, which isn't necessarily a skill you have as a child. That's something you have to develop over time. When you're an adult, you're messing things up for people that are really important to you. And so then you begin to take steps and be like, yeah, I have to, do these step-by-step aspects. I try to get out of the house when I work. Like, if I just sit at home and try to do work, I'm just going to go on the internet and watch baseball highlights, and like look up the San Francisco Giants. Like, I'm not going to do what I'm supposed to do. And so I spend a lot of time at the Politics and Prose cafe downstairs a lot of time at the Politics and Prose Cafe downstairs, because it's like John Cheever, the great, John Cheever said, like, he had to, like, fool himself and put on a big suit and go to his laundry room and, like, sit at a table in his laundry room for 8 hours. And he's like, oh, I'm at the office, and right. And, like, I have to trick myself in those ways. And so coming to Politics and Prose and getting a big pot of tea at 8:30 after I drop my son off at the bus, and there's nobody here, which is nice, to the Modern Times Cafe, which is fantastic. You should all go to it. That's a way of tricking myself as if I'm going into work and have to do it. And I can't take a nap or feed my cats, or watch Beloved Giants, when I'd like to. So I think that's really important.
Is there another question over there? Okay. Hi. What was your relationship like with teachers growing up? And then within that context, is there any kind of training for modern day teachers and explaining that and tools that they can have to make the environment friendly for people who have ADHD?
That's a good question. It was pretty subjective. Like, it would be one great year where somebody was really pragmatic, and a teacher was like, it's cool. Like, it's not a big deal. Like, let's everybody relax. We'll be fine. And there were other teachers that were really having a tough time. Problem is the teacher has the power within the room. And I think it's much different now in terms of awareness and education. I was raised in the 90s. I believe in social justice and, like, awareness. Like, I think awareness is an important thing. And I think awareness is better now. But back, when I was growing up in the 80s and early 90s, it was a crapshoot. And so if you have a certain level of privilege and you can have a nice private school where maybe there's 12 kids, and you're allowed to get up and wander around and come back to your seat. I once taught as a sub where kids were allowed to do that. I'm like, what's going on? Like, it was amazing. That's awesome. But if you're in a 30-person private or public school, it's going to depend on the skill of the teacher. And when that happens, your luck will run out. It's like rolling the dice. It was in my experience. And you just run into somebody that was really tight, and really couldn't deal with that, and would begin to rely on really extreme measures, like dragging your desk into the hallway and you spending the day in the hallway to deal with that. And so my experience was hit or miss. Once I got to middle school, it was better. I don't know what you guys experience, but middle school, you only have a child for an hour if you're a teacher a day, instead of a child for 8 hours. And so middle school was better. You'd have a bad hour, but then you'd move to somebody else. Middle school's hard for ADHD, especially because then you forget your book, everything's in your locker, you didn't bring your lunch, you have to move classrooms, you don't have your, so middle school can be really tough. But in terms of teachers, it was better. Now I think that it's like the newspaper articles. The newspaper article in 1980 says, we don't know if this is a social construct, we don't know if this doesn't exist. Now the newspaper articles say, 5% of people are overactive and have a tough time. The question is, do 10 or do 15, right? And that wasn't the question in 1985. The question was, does anybody? And so I think that difference has helped in the classroom a lot. Again, it gets back to privilege, and that's why it's so hard. And that's why medication, too. If you can do an environmental thing, like if you can have an environmental situation where you can wander around and the teacher gives you that space to come back and go and gives you that attention, then you probably don't need or may not need a stimulant, which will make everything closer and take away the overactivity. But if you don't have that kind of attention because you don't have that privilege, it's a hard thing to judge somebody that goes on a stimulant in that situation and it works and somebody doesn't get expelled, or somebody is actually having all the conflict that their behavior creates be turned down so that they can experience the material in front of them, which is the intellectual material that they're trying to learn. My answer is usually it's just a really difficult situation. Either way. Thank you.
Sorry. Is somebody on this side? Okay. Hi, my name is Victor Miller. You may have answered this previously, but what's the best way of finding somebody in this city who treats ADD in adults?
That's a good question. I think it's hard. And this gets into that question of, is it 5% or 15%? Because people are going to be suspicious of you. They're like, why do you want stimulants? Like if you go into somebody and are like, I'm having a really hard time, some of the psychiatrists I've met can be suspicious, and we could say rightfully so or not, but it's hard for people that are really having a tough time. I mean, I was very lucky. I found somebody through my insurance. I have a good psychiatrist, Bethesda. He's wonderful. Dr. Selassie, he would appreciate this reference, I'm sure. And he's just absolutely, he's careful and attentive. And I felt immediately, and this is probably part of his skill. It's like you talk about with teachers. Some teachers have skills. Some teachers don't when it comes to the specific situation. we were just able to, I was able to articulate how things were tough, and he was able to see it, I think, in a nice way. And so you got to go through your healthcare because it's a hard thing. Like, I wouldn't go for somebody that wasn't covered. I'm lucky enough to have healthcare and be covered by it. And I think a psychiatrist or a psychiatrist that works in tandem with a psychologist are very good.
How do you spell Dr. Salasi?
Celaisse. He's awesome.
S-A?
Celaisse. But I think the larger point is that you want somebody that is listening to what you're saying. I think the hardest thing for my mother, when she and my father, when they were bringing me in, was that doctors would immediately think they knew what the situation was. And there'd be no space left. There'd be no dialogue. There'd be no questioning. They would just say, this is this. I have my experience. And they wouldn't be listening to any other thing that God said. And I think that's really frustrating for parents, to just not be listened to. You're like, I'm sorry, I don't have a medical degree. I'm not a psychiatrist. Would you please let me keep talking and not interrupt me and tell me, that this is what I have or this is what's going on. And I think that's important. I think it's hard to ask a doctor to see everything from a patient's perspective. I think that's very difficult, and a good doctor would be like, well, that has its problems too. But I think a certain degree of empathy is important, and that's what I've noticed.
Is someone over there?
There's significant challenges with ADHD. There also are qualities in terms of perseverance and usually very high intellect and other positives. And I'm wondering what you think in terms of how our culture and how those smart, kind people around somebody with ADHD can support them.
I think that's a really good question. I think one of the things I tried to write about is that willpower and intelligence are separate entities. And we think that willpower is intelligence. We think that if you work hard and if you try hard at something, then you'll get the result, and somehow intelligence folds into that. But what happens is if you, from a lot of the, literature that exists on ADHD is that you actually need to see those as separate entities. Like, willpower isn't necessarily the same thing as intelligence, which is hard for us, I think, to conceptualize and understand. And once you keep that in mind, and I've had certain teachers keep that in mind, it's like your behavioral progress is different than your academic progress. And that was, to me, in 1989, a revolutionary concept, that those could be separate, because those were completely conflated in everything that I did. You say stupid stuff, you're stupid, and I do say stupid stuff. But like the academic development is actually a separate thing from impulsivity. And the problem is they get conflated, and I think that's really hard for parents that are struggling with it and kids that are struggling with it. And one thing that the research has tended to, from what I've read, that the research has tended to show is that they're actually different paths in terms of willpower development, intellectual development. Problem is, if you're just fighting with everybody every day in class all the time, you're not going to be learning the material. If that's the problem with ADHD is it's not being overactive, that's the problem. It's that overactivity causes conflict. And that conflict keeps you from from learning or from engaging what's being presented to you. And then you're at a disadvantage that way because you've just missed everything that's going on. And that's where it becomes really hard.
So you had a question earlier about training for teachers. I'd like to ask you a different question, which is the structure of schooling and maybe the structure of working for people with ADHD. It's occurred to me watching people we know well with ADHD that an ideal school would be one where you had 45 minutes or 30 minutes of academic substance and 45 minutes of intense physical activity in a continuous loop. And my brother observed at one point that the people he knew with ADHD would have been just fine 150 years ago as frontier scouts. So maybe...
Go ahead of all of us. And come back and tell us what you see is true.
Maybe you could talk a little about how we might adjust structures, both at the educational and employment level, to allow people to benefit from the single-minded focus, high intelligence, and avoid the other.
I think physical activity is one of the most important things. My father was a professional baseball player. That's what he did. He played baseball. I think that now, and I answer it from a ethos, from my background, now exercise is the most important thing. Like, exercise is necessary in my life, like for me to be not a jerk, or for me to be a functioning person. Like, exercise, and that's not something that occurred to me till I was like 28, and I mean that it actually has an incredible mental health benefit. I'm not sure how I would say how school should adjust or how work should adjust. I can just say from my experience, but from my experience, being able to have a flexible work schedule, and someone like, Ned Hollowell would say the same thing, is that if you can identify, and we can just leave out the term ADHD, if you can identify that you're more productive when you create your own goals and hit them and meet them, and you get more things done than if you have to go somewhere from 8 to 5, and from that 8 to 5, you don't hit the goals that you've set, and this is your own experience, then we're very lucky that in the 21st century that in some situations you can have a more flexible schedule. And for me, working in physical activity, that is necessary. My tennis partner, Jim Turner, who I play tennis 5 days a week with, is sitting right there. I mean, that's necessary. Like, if I don't play tennis with Jim Turner, I'm not a pleasant person to be around. Like, it's very important that that physical activity happens. But you would think that someone would tell you that and you'd know it. But that was like a revelation when that happened to me, that makes my life better. And I had played sports and done things all the time. But when you're playing sports and doing things as a child, it's a different path than when you're doing them as an adult for the exercise, where you feel a benefit like you would feel from other therapies or things going on.
What's up, Tim? How you doing?
Officer?
I'm wondering when you decided or came to the realization that you wanted to write about this. Like, what was it in you, or what you were working on that you said, you know what, I want to write about this, and how did you begin to do that?
That's an excellent question. I was in graduate school, where Matt was also, and I was trying to write a book on Barry Bonds, God bless him, and I couldn't articulate the point of view that I wanted, which was that everybody's ridiculous on both sides, let's find a middle ground. And I really felt it slipping through my fingers, like I couldn't write this book. And it was similar themes about drugs and American society and what's going on. And I began to write about moments from the beginning of memory that were really important to me, that had their own narratives built in. I had images, I had scenes, I had events, and I was in school to be doing those things. And they were things that felt that they were necessary to me, but I didn't understand what they meant yet, and I didn't understand why they were important. And so the act of telling them via the tools I was lucky enough to be learning while I was in school there, narrative, image, setting, character, all these things that we had been working on, helped me in the act of doing it to gain a better perspective. And I ended up writing a ton on ADHD via just personal experience. And then when I moved here, I began to incorporate a historical thread because I needed to create perspective and distance. Everything was so close. My goal was to recreate the way a child saw the world via ADHD. Like out fiction, your goal is to recreate somebody else sees the world. But I learned that was too limiting. Like through draft and draft, I realized the reader had no space to do their own work, to maneuver, to have an opinion on what was going on. It was just blow after blow after blow of difficult situations. And so I used the historical aspect and the research to kind of give a perspective on what was happening, not in the terms of I think this or I think that, but the reader could just take a break for 2 or 3 pages and like read about Freud, and the horse penises of Vienna, and then like ha ha ha, and then go back to the fun, and then go back to the, in the way that they're recreated through the child's point of view, so they're inherently over intense because the goal is to articulate it the way that the child saw it, and I just realized that needed to be cut step by step, and it was hard. It was hard to realize that it was very nice to be excited about writing about how a child might see the world and recreate a point of view that's lost, because I don't see the world that way anymore. But I did once, and I was trying to recreate it. But it was hard to realize that something more was needed for this book, for it to be something that was bigger than it just happening to me. And I tried to use the narrative to do that, but in addition to that, the essayistic information, and the historical thread, I like to think gave the space so that it could become something more. We went to school in the Midwest together. It's my dear friend.
Please, can you talk about the role of passion and finding your passion as a way to lead you forward into an adulthood that's comfortable? I'm speaking as a parent, but also I'm a school social worker, so I'm working with kids all the time around this. And I'm just curious how, so passion, but also how adults can help a child to connect with their passion. I feel like so often a child who is really struggling will be like, no, that's not what I want to do. And you kind of feel like, oh, if only they would just, try. That might be the thing, but it also might not be. So please.
I think it's hard. I think, as a parent, I don't like Pokemon. I don't like, what's my son watching now? Lego Chima. I find them to be over the top, and but you have to get excited what your son gets excited about. And so when it comes to passion doesn't have to be media, passion doesn't have to be anything else. But people are inherently captivated. And some of the hardest things is when we're in a situation or we're in a mode through which we're told to be captivated in a very specific way with very specific subjects. And so one thing I like to do as a parent is to try to be elastic in the best way that I can and be on the lookout. If it's mini golf, it's mini golf. If it's riding BMX bikes, it's riding BMX bikes. But passion itself is important as opposed to what you're passionate about. And when it comes to adulthood, again, it's a level of privilege. Like, I'm very lucky that I get to be a writer and get to be passionate about that. I mean, 3 generations back, I'd be breaking horses in, Los Gatos probably. But I'd be, I would be in a different situation if I were 3 generations back. I'm very privileged. I've been given every opportunity from my parents and from the situation to create a schedule that I can try to succeed in and to be able to be an academic or a teacher or a writer or a father, or a husband. I don't know if those opportunities would always be available to me, and I'm thankful for those opportunities. And so my passion isn't necessarily just about me trying to be passionate about stuff and like talking to my excellent students about great nonfiction, but that's also a gift to be able to talk about that. And I think it's important to acknowledge that not everybody has. I'm pretty lucky to be able to do that.
Hi, Tim. You had a question earlier about adult onset or adult diagnosed ADHD, and this sort of expands on that. My father is in his 60s, and he was adult diagnosed with ADHD. And so I was wondering if you have any thoughts on family members dealing with it, like not necessarily parents of children with ADHD, but children of parents with it, or or like you as grandparents with it, or you as a father with a.
This is Jesse,
son.
one of my many excellent students. That's a very good question. My response is that what I think is changing is that suddenly your pediatrician that you roll up and see, or your doctor for your grandfather that you roll up and see, is going to be like, I took Ritalin, for 5 years in the 90s. This is what the experience was like for me. This is what it wasn't. That is not an opportunity for a doctor, for 99.9% of all doctors over 60 years old, or over 50 years old. That's just not an opportunity that you're going to run into. And so I think trying to help, especially 50s, 60s, 70s, like 80s, 90s, James Salter's coming later, hundreds, later this fall. I think that if you're trying to help somebody in that situation, one of the benefits is going to be that you can try to find mental health professionals and medical professionals that went through this as a thing, where for so many people in the society, ADHD didn't exist and it didn't. It just wasn't there, and then it was. And that's hard. And that's a hard thing to go and address. And so the way things turn over, I think, this generation, next generation, I hope, is you're going to run into adults within the medical profession that aren't going to be, that are going to have personal experience with it as well as a medical experience with it. And I like to think that that's an important thing.
Technology is kind of a double-edged sword for people with ADHD. It's really easy to just get sucked into the internet and waste a lot of time, even for those without it. And my question is, are there any tools that you used in terms of computer or iPhone that have been particularly helpful for you, whether it's blocking the internet when you're writing, and have you ever used an organizational coach?
That's an excellent question. There's a great program on your computers that everybody should use. It's called Freedom, and it locks your computer from the internet for like 3 hours. And you have to do these crazy reset, quit. I mean, it's really hard. Like, I'll do it. Like, once every 10 times, I'll just give in and unlock it that I've locked it. But it's just the most fantastic thing on a Mac that it locks it. and you can't get back on. Paul, downstairs, they had turned off the internet from 11 till 3, and I went to the barista. I was like, this is the best thing you guys have ever done. He's like, thank you. People are so mad about it. People have been really upset and like yelling at us. And now it's back that you can have internet downstairs. And so freedom then is, I'll use that app downstairs. On the converse side, like, I think it's great to be like, Siri, I have an appointment at 3 p.m. Remind me of it. And like that quick oral move, like that's just fantastic. Like you can have that recorded. And if it's about impulsivity, if you have that, but then you just don't do the next step and the next step, which is the pen, and write it down, or have your book where it's all organized, you have this mini computer on you that you tell it to remind you later of things, and it does. I think that's pretty fantastic. And so I try to use it in that sense. You can have shared calendars. Like those kinds of aspects, like a shared calendar is fantastic. So everybody can see, you're like, you planned this. I'm like, no, I didn't. Oh, I did plan that. You're right. I told Siri to plan that at that time under the thing. And so I think that that's really important. I think that reading is really important. I think that reading is a space where your mind is doing a lot of work, but you're also calm. And as much as you talk about ADHD and overactivity, I'll talk to a lot of people with children with ADHD or about ADHD, and they'll be like, my son will just play video games, or my daughter will just do this. Reading is another aspect of that. If you're interested in it, you'll do it. It's you can do anything. It's how well you do it. And if that's actually what you love, if you love dragons, like you'll read a lot of books about dragons. Like children still will, even you'll think ADHD won't do it. Like the interests can be measured, and I think that reading is the best space for me physically. Like if I'm trying to go to bed at night and I feel like I want to run around and I'm like kind of crazy, if I read for a while, starting it is hard. Telling myself to get in bed or sit down and read is hard. But once I do it, that happens to be, for me, a space that makes me less physically want to get up and run around, which I feel. Good.
Time for one more question.
I have a question. I don't think anyone has mentioned this yet. We've talked about parents and children and teachers. You haven't mentioned anything about marriage. Can you speak to that a little bit? How being an ADHD adult affects your marital relationship? Not to get too personal, but you did write a book.
I can plug a piece about, there's a piece on Time today about, time.com about being a parent, and what you can do with ADHD. And I think whenever you're in a deep relationship with anybody, whether it be a child, whether it be a spouse, whether it be a parent, or even a grandparent, there's going to be issues of giving and taking. There's going to be issues of how much work somebody does and how much work somebody else does. And if you're not good at keeping track of everything that's going on, and somebody else happens to be good at like seeing the dishes and doing them, or like knowing that it's been a month since the lawn is mowed, and maybe it doesn't upset you that the lawn's that high, but that lawn's kind of high, and like maybe we should. It's often not that I think I don't want to do that. It's that I haven't noticed it. And when you're in a relationship with somebody else, you have to notice it because it can cause harm you're not noticing. And you have to become better at noticing things because of the way it affects the people that are important to you. And when it comes to a relationship with ADHD, ADHD has a lot of benefits, like whatever it is, and whatever it is in adulthood. If you happen to match up with somebody, and I'm lucky enough that I am, then it can become a strength in saying how you feel, in drawing somebody out, and then their traits can become a strength. So I think a lot of times it's who you're with and not necessarily whether it's ADHD or not. But I think it's also important to realize ways that you make things harder for people and to try to do your best with people you love if you can be on top of that a little bit more. And if you happen to fall into certain, avenues of how you make things harder for people, then staying ahead of those can make your relationship much better.
I'd like to thank Tim for coming out tonight.
Thank you guys. Thank you for your questions.